Welcome back to the next lesson. For this week, we're going to be continuing to define water quality terminology, differentiating between key concepts. For example, our nutrient loss strategy here in Illinois versus the approach taken with a TMDL in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Then we're also going to work towards understanding water quality within a broader context. For example, I mentioned the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and this is because you'll remember one of the high-level learning objectives for this class is to develop an understanding of how the complexity of ag operations, natural systems, and policies like TMDLs or state nutrient strategies impact our efforts to improve water quality. In this lesson, we're mainly going to talk some of the specifics of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, NLRS, you might hear me call it, but I wanted to start by putting in context some of the earlier environmental movement. This timeline shows some of the earliest water quality related legislations in our country, starting back in 1899. But you'll note that one of the most active times environmentally in terms of legislations was right around late 60s, early 70s. One person who is an important driver of this activity that I wanted to talk about some was Miss Rachel Carson. We've talked about some male scientists over the past couple of weeks, and so I felt like it was time to bring in a female, and talking about Rachel Carson fits this lesson perfectly. Rachel Carson may be somewhat of a divisive figure, depending on how you feel about the environmental movement, but nevertheless, she's credited with really awakening the American public to thinking about the environment. So she fits well in this lesson. She was an aquatic biologist, author, and conservationist who was born and raised in rural Pennsylvania. When she was in college, she originally started out as an English or a writing major, but then she switched to biology. And I think this is important to bring up, or interesting to bring up, because sometimes even people who are famous in their fields didn't know exactly what they wanted to do starting out and switch majors. After her graduation, Ms. Carson began working with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries in 1935. Today, the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which falls within the U.S. Department of Interior. In 1936, 1 year later, she became one of only 2 women employed with the Bureau who was employed at a professional level, so like not a secretary. And I think this is really amazing because just historical context, women had gained the right to vote in the United States in 1920. So this wasn't that long after women had gained the right to vote. So I imagine she faced some adversity as a woman scientist. She eventually became the editor-in-chief of all Fish and Wildlife Service publications because she still did have an interest in writing. And she eventually decided to write her own books, not just editor-in-chief for Fish and Wildlife publications. Her first book came out in 1941, and it was a bestseller. She followed that up in 1951, 10 years later, and that was also a bestseller. These are bestsellers because she had a unique ability to present complicated scientific information in a very straightforward way. Again, she was credited with awakening the American public to thinking about the environment. So she was able to explain concepts in clear and captivating and very poetic language that resonated with the public. After the success of these first 2 books in 1941 and 1951, she decided to leave the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Bureau of Fisheries and write full-time. So you see a 3rd book came out. And then she's really known for the book Silent Spring, which came out in 1961. The insecticide DDT had been released in 1945, and some of Rachel Carson's work with the Fish and Wildlife Service or Bureau of Fisheries showed that DDT could have a harmful effect on marine life. So when Silent Spring came out in 1962, it called for a caution about chemicals like DDT and urged research to be done to find alternatives for these pesticides where we could find alternatives for the most dangerous pesticides. Not surprisingly, this was met with a firestorm of controversy, particularly from the chemical companies, as well as led to some personal attacks on her professional integrity. Turns out, years later, the federal government ordered a complete review of pesticide policy, and in 1972, DDT was banned for agricultural uses. In Silent Spring, this book, Rachel Carson asks the hard questions about whether and why we as humans have the right to control nature. She also asks, do we as humans have a right to decide who lives and who dies, including some of our aquatic counterparts. So I hope this bio gives you a little food for thought about your own personal environmental philosophies. And then coming back to our Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy specifically, I've mentioned the Gulf of Mexico several times throughout the course, and the monitoring of the hypoxic zone, which started in the mid-'80s. As a result of that monitoring, the Mississippi River / Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force was formed in 1998. So we realized starting in the mid-'80s, we were having this hypoxic zone in the Gulf. 1998, the task force forms. The task force includes federal agencies, like representation from the US EPA, USDA, Department of Interior, Army Corps, and then NOAA. And then a key part of the task force is representation from the 12 states who sit on the task force. And these members from the states are usually the director of either the environmental agency or the ag agency in each of these 12 states. Side note, the Mississippi River Basin drains or partially drains parts or all of 31 states. The 12 states that send the most water and the most nutrients to the Mississippi River are the 12 states that sit on the Hypoxia Task Force. So that's why we're one of those states. We also happen to border the Mississippi River. Our representative currently on the Hypoxia Task Force is John Sullivan, who heads the Illinois Department of Agriculture. You'll also note there is tribal representation on the task force. Starting in 2006, the US EPA requested that the science surrounding the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone be reviewed to better assess things like the cause and the duration of the hypoxic zone that happens every summer in the Gulf of Mexico. And this 2006 review of science led to a new action plan in 2008. The 2008 action plan called for all 12 states on the task force to develop their own state strategy for how each state was going to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that they were sending downstream. The 2008 action plan is also important because it was the first time that we had officially recognized that we need to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus that we're sending down the Mississippi River. It used to be that we were only concerned about nitrogen in the Mississippi River. 2008 action plan called for a dual nutrient strategy, reducing the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus both by 45% in the Mississippi River. Enter the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy. To me, the US EPA calling for each state to develop its own strategy was a phenomenal idea given the spatial extent of the Mississippi River Basin, the variety of environments and ecoregions from the northern part of the Mississippi River to the mouth of the Mississippi River, and the variety of types of agriculture spreading across that entire Mississippi River Basin. US EPA could have chosen an approach for us closer to that of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which has a TMDL, total maximum daily load. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Back to the general idea of the state strategies. Again, the US EPA supports these state strategies as a voluntary approach to improving water quality, especially for non-point source pollution. This word voluntary is very tricky though, and I think sometimes misinterpreted. Achieving the goals set out by the US EPA, 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus that we send downstream, that is not voluntary. Those goals are set. What's voluntary is that we get to choose how to achieve those goals. So we get to choose what practices and what we do to make that happen. So the word voluntary is very tricky. And again, our goals are to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that we send downstream by 45%. Getting into some of the technical details of the document itself, the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy defines our statewide nutrient goals. For example, the state of Illinois as a whole sends about just over 400 million pounds of nitrate nitrogen downstream down the Mississippi River every year. The agricultural sector is about 330 million pounds per year. If we reduce our nutrient load by 45%, that means we'll be sending just over 200 million pounds of nitrogen down the Mississippi River. From ag in particular, we need to reduce the amount of nitrogen we're sending downstream by 150 million pounds every year. Same thing for phosphorus. The order of magnitude of the numbers are a little different. You'll see as a state, we're sending downstream just over 35 million pounds of phosphorus every year. From ag, we need to reduce the amount of P we send downstream by about 8 million pounds. Another thing our nutrient strategy does is that it apportions loads between sources. And you could have pulled this information out from the last graph, but No surprise here. From agriculture, agriculture supplies about 80% of the nitrogen we send downstream. Phosphorus is slightly less. Agriculture is only contributing about 50% of the phosphorus we send downstream, but still 50% is not zero. So we have our work cut out for us on both fronts in terms of agriculture. Our nutrient strategy also defines reduction goals and timelines. Illinois has an interim goal, or a phase 1 goal, occurring in 2025 to reduce our nitrate nitrogen loads by 15% and our total phosphorus loads by 25%. This is higher, this 25% is higher than the 15% because much of the reduction in phosphorus loads will come from wastewater treatment plants, like the Chicago wastewater treatment plants, the Metropolitan Waste Reclamation District, MWRD. They're able to make some changes relatively quickly, so we felt like we were able to achieve 25% reduction sooner for phosphorus. Again, the ultimate goal is 45%. You will note that our nutrient loss reduction strategy does not associate this ultimate goal with a time. So this is not a time-bound goal in our nutrient strategy for Illinois. The US EPA expects this 45% reduction to occur by 2035. That number is not, that date is not in our Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy. Just really kind of for political reasons. We were not willing to commit to a timeline on that ultimate goal. The US EPA goal is out there though for 2035. And then my favorite part of the strategy is that it actually recommends conservation practices and provides scenarios to landowners to help us meet the 45% reduction. I provided you this fact sheet, which isn't actually a part of the strategy, but it's based on the strategy. This fact sheet helps go through some of the practices that we recommend, and we'll get to those later on in the course too. To wrap up, I do want to take a side trip to the Chesapeake Bay watershed to provide contrast to the approach taken by the US EPA here in the Midwest with the state strategies. In late 2010, the US EPA established a TMDL for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. This was prompted by about 25 years of not seeing a lot of progress in cleaning up the water in the Chesapeake Bay region. A TMDL is a total maximum daily load. A TMDL is technically a calculation or a specific number, a load, TMDL load, of nitrogen or phosphorus or sediment, a load of nitrogen or phosphorus or sediment. The TMDL is the maximum amount of a pollutant allowed to enter a water body so that that water body can meet the water quality standards set for that particular pollutant in that particular water body. You see on the right of the screen the process for developing a TMDL. Not real simple. Starting with adopting your standards, you do some monitoring, the water gets listed as impaired. If it's impaired, if it fails to meet its water quality standards, and then you develop TMDLs, and there's feedback loops along the way. TMDL sets the pollution reduction goals necessary to meet the TMDL that's been set. TMDLs need to be established for every water body that's listed as impaired. For example, we have 600 TMDLs set for water bodies in Illinois. I'm showing you page 1 of 24. I'm showing you a screen clip, page 1 of 24 of the status of the TMDLs that our state is working on. FYI, our list of impaired water bodies is 57 pages. So we obviously have our work cut out for us in developing TMDLs, which again is not a simple process. Now coming back to the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, it's remarkable because it was the largest TMDL ever created. It's a massive effort to clean up the bay involving 6 states and the District of Columbia. Specifically, the TMDL in the bay calls for a reduction by 2025, 25% reduction in inloads, 24% reduction in P-loads, and 20% reduction in sediment loads. I will note finally that TMDLs don't technically have regulatory teeth for non-point sources of nutrients and sediment, although setting a TMDL is viewed as much more of a regulatory approach than our state strategy. So bringing it back to Illinois, the approach of a TMDL is still definitely viewed as a more regulatory approach than the voluntary state strategy approach. Thanks a lot. See you next time.